Welcome to our virtual space, where thought leaders who, in a variety of ways, have committed themselves to improving our lives share their work, perspectives on current affairs, and what brought them to where they are today. My name is Rob Liu, and this is The Exchange. So, Ron, thank you so much for joining us on The Exchange. As you know, The Exchange is very much focused on really getting multiple perspectives on how COVID-19 has changed our lives and will continue to change our lives going forward. If there's one thing that strikes me about your work is that your emphasis not only on leadership, but that leadership has to be adaptive, that leadership has to evolve in sort of response to change. I can't imagine a person that is more appropriate for us to talk to in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I have lots of questions for you, Ron. I'd love to get your take on a number of things. But before we come to that, for the sake of our listeners and our viewers, can you share with us in your own words what it is that you do, what it is that you focus on, what it is that gets you out of bed in the morning in terms of your own work?
Uh, I think I started my career as a doctor, and had thought I was going to become a surgeon, but I had a job in shortly after medical school. After my first year of clinical training, I had some moonlighting jobs. I took a year off because I was late in applying for surgical residencies. I was going to go into neurosurgery, and so I was accepted to a great neurosurgical residency program, but I needed to delay for a year. So during that year, I went back to New York City and studied music for the year. I was at Juilliard part-time, but also to make a living, I was licensed to practice medicine as a general practitioner. And the first job I was able to get was a moonlighting job at Rikers Island Prison in New York City. And that's the big prison for New York City. You fly over it whenever you fly into LaGuardia Airport. Nobody's flying right now, but many people have flown into LaGuardia. The pilot never says, "Look out your right window if you're on the right side of the plane," and because you're flying over Rikers Island. They'll frequently tell you there's Manhattan and the skyline of Manhattan. They'll point out great great sights to see there, but not the one that's right beneath you. Rikers Island was a real wake-up call for me because I grew up in the late 1960s at Columbia University, demonstrating, occupying buildings, and being quite politically active, and thinking a lot about the systemic nature of political events, and in a way, the systemic nature of political behavior of people in politics. Trying to understand politicians not just as a product of their own personal inclinations, but also as a product of a set of systemic forces that if you look through a politician, you'd have to begin to see their constituency in order to be able to understand why they're taking the position they're taking. So those questions were quite alive with me. And when I started working in the prison, the patterns of social illness were so striking. Nearly everybody coming into the prison was Black or Hispanic and poor. Nearly everybody had experienced a lot of injustice already, just by the random nature of the particular circumstance into which they were born. And that rekindled in me a desire to work at the systemic level, to figure out how to work on social processes and social illness, and so that I began to rethink my career as a product of 4 months of working in the prison and then examining inmates and seeing these patterns, obvious patterns. So uh, so that was the big break out of medicine, and then I had another moonlighting job at a fancy health clinic. It was on the other side of the moon, in a way, in Manhattan, at a life extension institute. It was called the Life Extension Institute, and their job was to examine corporate executives. And they were also entitled to a medical exam, but not by law because they've entered a prison and now you get a medical exam, but by their fringe benefit package. They would get this annual medical exam. And so I spent 6 hours a day examining corporate CEOs and senior vice presidents. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how they were mismanaging the stresses of their life, and how having a senior most position of authority is it's like sticking your fingers in high voltage electric sockets, and you're conducting more electricity than really that your body is prepared to conduct. And you might have an enormous amount of cultural software and upbringing and preparation, but nevertheless, these are highly stressful jobs. And a good half of the people, just impressionistically, 50% of the people that I examined over the course of that year were stressed out, and it was showing up in their lives in different ways. So those two jobs got me to rethink my career and to be thinking about leadership uh, and particularly in public life, because of my interest in the health of our societies and the health of our communities. Um, so I think that's what gets me up in the morning is I'm still a doctor at heart. I'm still all about treating illness or making or taking away pain or making life better for people, except I'm simply trying to do it at the systemic or aggregate or political level.
Ah, yeah. So that's a very interesting pathway to how you got interested in helping people in perhaps a very different way from how you might have imagined originally when you went to medical
Yes.
school, for example. But so I have to admit that I got to know your work, Ron, from conversations with colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School of Governance, where it was quite clear that your course on leadership is in fact a very famous component of the Kennedy School's curriculum. And I have spoken to countless individuals that have said that you have really changed their lives ultimately. You've changed how they view themselves as leaders, but you've also changed how they think about the very process and the act of leadership and what's really involved. So, of course, you think a lot about what it takes to lead. You think a lot about what it takes to lead in a time of crisis. And arguably, in almost every possible field we can think of right now, not just the medical field, we are in a time of crisis. So
Yes.
I bet you've been thinking a lot about, at a moment like this, what can leaders do? Can you share with us some of the insights that you have developed that perhaps extend from your existing work, but in some ways are nuanced by what's happened with COVID-19?
Yes, sure. I'd be delighted to. Well, first of all, I learned in drawing from my medical training and having worked in emergency rooms that there's a that crises have phases, and it's very important in the practice of leadership in a crisis to locate yourself in time in which phase am I in this crisis. Of course, different crises have different the properties of those phases are quite different, of course. Um, but but uh, but it as a first approximation, it's important to think that there is a role for the in the acute emergency phase to simply stabilize the patient. You're not necessarily trying to work the underlying problem. You're not necessarily even trying to diagnose the underlying problem because it may be too complex. You don't have the time or the wherewithal. But your job is to stabilize the situation and buy time so that other people can engage in much more lengthy diagnostic testing and deliberation to try to identify what's the underlying disorder and then how would one go about treating it. So there's a very, very important um, uh, acute emergency phase of most crises. Now, sometimes those are very short. You stabilize the situation, and then you immediately move into what could be called the adaptive phase, where you begin to try to discover what are the underlying challenges for which we need to build new capacity. Um, so a patient has a heart attack, let's say, or chest pain, and you stabilize the situation in the emergency room, and then maybe even after the stabilization, part of the treatment requires uh, technical work. You might do cardiac surgery or put a stent in, but then you're still left with a significant component of the work to be done in giving that patient as long a life as possible, in which if the patient himself or herself doesn't take responsibility for the problem, you've really only solved part of the problem. You've done as best as you can with your technical expertise, but the rest of the problem is left unsolved, and that is the part of the problem that remains lodged in that person's own lifestyle, in their attitudes and their behavior, in the way they eat, in the way they smoke, in the exercise they get, in the way they manage stress. And so uh, um, so in this particular crisis, um, it has a very long acute emergency phase. And even the acute emergency phase requires an enormous amount of adaptation. We can't simply instrument a stabilization of the situation through the know-how we've already developed and simply implement and execute that know-how expertly. Sometimes you can in a crisis. You apply your know-how, stabilize the situation, and then you work on the adaptive phase. But in this particular crisis, the acute emergency phase itself is very long and also requires a lot of adaptation. Now, there will come a time when there's a vaccine, when we can, and maybe even during this phase, where we can begin to identify, this crisis is also highlighted or surfaced, or like it's like a tidal wave that first the ocean is drawn out. It reveals the bottom of the ocean that we knew was there, but we never weren't really looking at. It's revealed all sorts of underlying structural problems in our societies, deep inequities, for example, in the education system, in the health system, in housing. People who live in more dense neighborhoods are going to die at a much higher rate. Communities that don't have access to health care, and so forth. And in education, some kids have laptops and wireless accessibility, and some teachers know how to move to online education. But a lot of teachers have no idea what to do, and a lot of kids don't have laptops and don't have wireless, and they're living in households where families don't know how to substitute for the teachers. So we're seeing all sorts of underlying problems, even problems in our diet. We these viruses, HIV, SARS, COVID-19, these are all viruses that came from other species and have cross species because of our eating habits, because of the way with HIV, people were eating bushmeat, monkey bushmeat in certain places in Central Africa, and in this case, it was SARS. People were contaminating their meat with bat and other kinds of animal contaminants that allowed these viruses to cross species. So there are underlying structural problems in our diet that are and others. So the crisis. There will come a time when we can begin to address some of the underlying problems that have been revealed by or highlighted by the crisis. But right now, in the moment that we're in, we're still in this long acute emergency phase, which I think is going to persist until there's a vaccine or a good treatment. And though the economy may fluctuate, it's probably going to dive again when we get another wave, because I just don't see how we prevent that from happening as we rush to open up our economies. So the first thing in leadership then is to locate yourself, because if you rush to treat the underlying problems when people's 95% of their brain is captured by simply trying to answer the question, how am I going to make it through the day without killing my kids at home? How am I going to make it through the day to feed my family? How am I going to make it through the day when I'm running out of money? People are working really primary questions right now in simply trying to stabilize the situation. And so the leadership required right now is the mobilization of adaptability in countless micro environments where every family is having to figure out its own particular micro adaptation to their particular micro environment. And every business and every school room and every schoolhouse and every different district and every different university department, and every different laboratory. I've been doing work with the Broad Institute for the last few years, and as they begin to come online, it's taking enormous creativity to, okay, how do we get a lab back up online? Well, we're going to have shifts all night long, because we can only allow so many scientists at the bench, at a particular given time to maintain some sort of safety, social distancing. And so there are all of these adaptations that are taking place right now. And what I've been encouraging people to do is to treat this crisis as an enormous schoolhouse. Because if we could begin to capture the lessons about adaptability, again, across all sectors, from micro to macro, very successful cases, as well as all sorts of maladaptations and failed cases, we will develop a rich set of heuristics to then draw upon in educating people to all of the other kinds of adaptive challenges that we've been neglecting and struggling to figure out. How do you help people understand that climate change requires distributed responsibility and countless micro adaptations in every community all around the world, and isn't simply going to be solved by a technologist coming up with a fuel cell?
Right.
No,
of course.
And, so that's the beginning of how I think about it. Of course, I anchor my concept of leadership around the challenges of mobilizing adaptive work, of developing successful adaptations to changing and challenging conditions. Because I think in conditions that are known, for which we have already developed the expertise, because in a sense, yesterday we engaged in that adaptive work and now we figured it out. You don't need leadership in those contexts. You simply need authoritative know-how to drive the organizational responses and to get people to do the jobs they're already trained to do, according to the organizational procedures and processes that are already evolved to be designed to process that set of problems. But where we particularly need leadership is when it requires going beyond your authoritative know-how, where you've got to build new capacity, and where the people themselves become the substrate of that solution, because they are part of the problem. The problem lies in their attitudes and their child rearing habits and their ways of doing business and their ways of doing science. And then the adaptive work, the progress is made through the development of new capacity in them. And it's those situations that particularly call for leadership.
Yes. So I think, one thing I find really super interesting about what you've just said is that quite often when we think about the notion that leadership must be adaptive, we think of leaders in sort of a generic one size fits all. They're good ones, they're not so good ones, they're terrible ones.
Yes.
And we think about them adapting lockstep to change in the environment, like COVID-19, a stock market crash or something else that's happened. What you have underlined, which I think is almost rarely talked about, is the other side. There's a diversity of microenvironments, that you can have
Yes.
a massive change in the environment overall, which can be this new infectious disease that we have never seen before, but that there are all of these diversities of microenvironments where the
Yes.
response to the big environmental change of necessity must be different and should be different.
Exactly. And
So in
and
some ways,
and
I really admire this
yes.
sense
Yes.
of understanding not a generic sense of one's capacity as a leader, but
Yes.
how your capacity must be rooted in your situation.
Yes. And so I found it enormously useful, and I think my students over the last 4 decades have found it very useful to distinguish not only technical from adaptive challenges, so that they understand that the diagnostic process of scoping out an adaptive challenge and realizing then that frequently then one has to mobilize a multiplicity of adaptations that are appropriate to the different environments in which the problem emerges. Um, uh, but also to help students understand that there's a very important distinction to be drawn between leadership and authority. So there are an enormous number of problems for which we have already developed the expertise, and people with authoritative know-how are supposed to be trustworthy in knowing how to then guide us in driving and mobilizing the organizational response. In our university, Rob, we look to the president of the university to know what to do, you know? Now, here's the dilemma. Because we spend so many, literally decades, socialized into believing that in a time of stress, turn to authorities for an answer. And because authorities can deliver an answer a great number of times, statistically, the vast majority of times, um, uh, that's what we have come to expect. And the social contract is formed around the expectation that all problems are amenable to authoritative know-how. And that puts an enormous amount of pressure and strain on people in positions of authority in organizational and political life to have answers to problems, even when they don't, even when it happens to be a challenge that is novel, a novel adaptive pressure, a novel adaptive challenge. It could be a natural phenomenon like this virus, or it could be an economic phenomenon like a financial meltdown that people don't really understand, as we did in 2008. How did we get here? And all of a sudden, President Bush is saddled with this towards the end of his presidency in 2008, with this enormous financial crisis. And Hank Paulson, smart people, they've been around. They ran Goldman Sachs. What do? Ben Bernanke or President Obama when he comes into office, with our former university president, Larry Summers, very smart people, but they're all in over their heads. They're all in over their heads because it's an adaptive challenge. There's novelty. They can't simply pull a solution off the shelf and instrument it. They can't put the patient to sleep and put in a stent or, put in a new valve. It's a problem in which the learning is going to be required, and in which the people themselves are part of the problem. And therefore, they're going to have to develop new capacity tailored to their own lives and their own situation. So when we begin to distinguish leadership from authority, we can begin to understand that one of the properties of adaptive challenges, of adaptive contexts, like this virus, are challenges that first require a different kind of behavior from our authority figures. People in high positions of authority in politics or organizations have to behave differently than simply succumbing to the temptation or the pressure to pretend that they know what to do when they don't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They have to begin to educate people that this is a situation of uncertainty. that it's going to require a lot of experimentation, that we're going to try this and try that, and 2 weeks later, we're going to have to revise what we thought. We thought we didn't need masks. Well, now we do need masks. You know, we thought we didn't need to close down for this long, but now we discover we do. We tried to open up, but it was a mistake. So we're going back home. You know, how are we going to teach online? Everybody at university life and really K through 12 has to be working that question right now. We've got to develop, teachers have to develop new capacity for how to teach using both the benefits and the limitations of our current technology. Kids and students are going to have to learn how to learn without all the benefits of the social structuring and human, support systems that are around them, and so forth and so on. So people in high positions of authority, the leadership job is then how do they mobilize adaptations throughout their organization or in politics throughout their community that's going to have to be tailored to the differentiated needs and demands and resources of each of those different local environments.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we see that in nature. One of the key principles in evolutionary biology, as you would be able to teach me about, Rob, is that we have local adaptations to local environments.
Yes.
And when Darwin saw finches with different sized beaks, it took, of course, decades to begin to, and really in the last couple of generations, for scientists to begin to identify, well, this beak is better for cracking this open seed, and depending on when El Nino hits, you're going to get trees with, with these seeds versus those seeds, and that's going to favor finches with these kind of beaks versus those kind of beaks, and so forth. So, but if you're living on a different island, that's not the adaptation you need, because you're not eating seeds, you're eating something else. So in a complex town, even a small community, Missoula, Montana, a small city, the job of leadership then is to generate micro adaptations to microenvironments and to mobilize that kind of innovation, trial and error, ways of working and thinking. And what that really ultimately requires then is not a dependency model of I depend on my authorities to be the source of all leadership, but instead the authority figures are mobilizing distributed leadership throughout the community, where you get micro adaptations mobilized by people providing leadership, mobilizing within their local community, within their family system, within their friendship, within their hospital ward, within their laboratory bench, within their particular schoolhouse. Well, how are we going to teach English? Well, that's different than how are we going to teach mathematics, and how are we going to teach, higher level versus lower level. And by the way, what do we do about nursery school?
Right. Yes.
I mean, that's like a whole different kind of set of adaptive challenges where we need leadership there.
Right.
We need people who are going to mobilize the innovation. And of course, we know in nature that there are, if we distill it down, which I do for my students, there are at least 3 basic tasks. What's essential to conserve? Because evolutionary biology tells us that transformative change is highly conservative. Most processes are conserved, even with transformative new capacity. 99% of our DNA is the same as a chimpanzee. And look at our range. And birds have an enormous adaptive range, but their DNA is like, well, I don't know, you tell me, what percent of their DNA is the same as a lizard? A lot.
Yes.
Probably more than 90%. So a key challenge then in leadership is, what do we want to conserve? Because one of the traps of leadership is to be so excited about the change that we don't talk about what we want to not change.
Mm-hmm.
Because people get scared if you're changing too many things at once. But if you can anchor the innovation in what you're trying to conserve, so that you're marrying the innovation to all that you want to conserve, so that you can take the best of your history into the future. Then it's a lot more likely that you can manage people through the losses of change.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because one of the properties that we see in nature is that you can conserve maybe 98 or 99% of the DNA with a radical innovation, but you still have to, deregulate or re-regulate or suppress, 1% or 2%, a significant percentage of your DNA in nature. Well, culture runs similarly. You have to figure out how you're going to leave behind some cultural artifacts to which people have deep loyalty,
Right.
because of course they internalize that cultural artifact through the love of their families and communities and elders and sacred texts. And the innovation is going to require letting go of some of that and refashioning those narratives. So then leadership is this three-part challenge. What are we going to conserve? What are we going to discard? And then what experiments can we run to generate over time the innovations that will give us the adaptive capacity we need to thrive in this new environment? And in a sense, we see right now in this great schoolhouse all sorts of wonderful examples of emerging adaptations from the most micro to the most macro. And we also see wonderful examples of people stepping up to the plate, providing leadership without authority, without waiting for the coach to call them into play, without waiting to be anointed or appointed, without waiting to be elected, but simply because they see a problem, they care about the people, and they pull people together and say, we need to work this.
So
You
I'm
know?
curious though, Ron, you've spoken to, it's like 100 million flowers blooming. So one question I have for you is, as a society though, how do we learn from those leaders without authority that are coming up with new ideas, new approaches? Because clearly in the crisis we're in now, we need that. We need this
Yes.
wonderful experimental sandbox with so many people trying sort of different
Yes.
things at a higher
Yes.
systemic level. How do we leverage that though and not run the risk that great ideas and great leadership dies on the vine?
Well, unfortunately, there are also strongly regressive
Mm,
tendencies in a crisis. Well, I have a simple graphic in which over over time the level of social disequilibrium rises and falls. You know, and a crisis is a spike in disequilibrium, a spike uh, in in where our normal processes are thrown out of kilter,
mhm.
where there's a deep sense of urgency. We've got to do something about this. Now, some technical problems also generate a spike in disequilibrium. A child breaks his leg, the parent is enormously distressed. But then you take the child in the emergency room or to the doctor and they fix the leg, and very quickly the disequilibrium abates and you have equilibrium is restored. One of the chief properties of authority systems is that people in authority feel under enormous pressure to restore equilibrium when a system is knocked out of kilter.
Mhm.
So what we're seeing right now is enormous pressure on people in positions of political authority to be more authoritative. Now, that's important because we need authoritative responses. Because just like a child, when he skins his knee, all of a sudden needs to see the parent. But on most days, the child can go through the whole day of school without needing to see the parent. But when the child's hurt, the child needs to see the parent. So, you know, um, in a crisis, it becomes we need the presence of people in authority to provide, to stabilize our sense of equanimity and our sense that somebody is on the watch, somebody's on the lookout, taking responsibility. Now, it takes a lot of self-discipline for politicians to not succumb to the pressure to begin to turn um, the need for providing authoritative presence that socializes people into the uncertainty, that socializes people into the need for distributed responsibility. It takes an enormous amount of self-discipline to, to, to shift to adaptive leadership in that context, not authoritative expertise. What we're seeing, though, however, is a lot of people with demagogic tendencies taking advantage of this heightened dependency need that populations have. They're taking advantage of it to strengthen their authoritarian regime, to subvert institutions that would check and balance their own particular, and it may be democratic institutions, or it may be in societies that are still not as democratic as we would think the word democracy would apply, but nevertheless still do have institutions that check and balance the authoritarian natures of the political principles. So we're in danger. We're in danger. This crisis, particularly because it's going to be prolonged, is going to, and even in the United States, we're in danger that it will subvert our elections in November, and people in positions of power will consolidate. So we really do need skilled and self-disciplined leadership from people. And now we do see, as a natural experiment, a lot of examples of people who are doing pretty well in those jobs, and we see a lot of variance. We also see people who are doing terribly in those jobs. And what will be interesting to see is those governors and mayors who are in denial of reality and don't really want to, because the hardest part in an adaptive challenge is to face into the harsh reality that you can't restore equilibrium quickly.
Yes.
That you can't restore people to their normal lives quickly. And facing into that reality that there's a real gap, that's going to take time to close because it's an adaptive challenge. We need to innovate and change, and it's going to take time for people to learn their way forward. We're seeing a lot of, now it could be that as the death rate mounts in those states and communities, people are going to have to learn the hard way. And that would be tragic. We saw that President Reagan would not wake up to the problem of HIV until the death rate mounted. People in the CDC could not get the attention of politicians to face into the HIV to AIDS when it emerged until people started dying. And unfortunately, sometimes that's the heuristic. People are going to, the death rate in certain populations. Now, as long as the populations that are dying are the more vulnerable populations to which some politicians care less because they're not one's constituent, it may work against the more democratizing social justice inclinations that at least I have, and I think that many have. So we need to build from these successful adaptations. Mm-hmm. We need to encourage the people who are figuring it out how to lead adaptively through this time and to mobilize adaptive work in a distributed way. And we also need to learn the lessons from the people who are getting it wrong. And then to capture those lessons and teach our publics so that our publics can become better citizens, in working the other adaptive challenges that, that have been festering in our society for many ages, or that loom like climate change right in front of us.
Yes. So it sounds like, yes, we are facing an enormous challenge, but that if we do get things right in terms of taking a more adaptive approach, a more distributed approach, we actually have an opportunity to foster creative solutions perhaps in
Yes.
surprising quarters that could be, in
Yes.
fact, really wonderful for us and really effective. So, Ron, I
Yes.
mean, I think there's so much that we could talk about, but there is one thing that I want to make sure we really provide for our listeners and viewers, which is to understand you a little bit. I mean, you have shared with us the remarkable path that you have taken to get to your work, which is focused on individual and organizational leadership. Um, and it's clear that for all of us, as we take our paths through life, there are always multiple forks in the road that appear. You had a fork in the road that involved, medicine on the one hand, working with individuals and organizations, perhaps simply put, on the other hand, in terms of leadership. If you had taken a different fork in the road, and of course, one would be that you would simply be, I shouldn't say simply, you would be a practicing physician. Are there sort of other forks where the Ron Heifetz that I'm talking to right now would be doing something entirely different from what you're doing now? Can you share with me and share with our viewers and listeners what that Ron Heifetz in a parallel universe might be doing?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is music. I grew up studying music. My two brothers played violin and piano. My sister played piano and danced. And one of my brothers became a concert violinist. The other became a doctor. And I grew up at one point in college. I decided to take a year off to study music full time. So I was very lucky to be invited to join the master class of one of the great cellists of the last century. His name was Gregor Piatigorsky, and he had a master class of about seven cellists from around the world. I learned a lot, by the way, about teaching from him because he taught through storytelling.
Yeah.
He taught cello through storytelling, which was very interesting. But his master class met twice a week for 5 hours a day, long. 5 hours a day. You'd bring your lunch, so there was sort of no breaks.
Mm-hmm.
And each of us would play a part of a piece, and then Piatigorsky would stop us, and sometimes he would illustrate by playing himself the phrase, but sometimes he would just launch into a story. And because I'd been studying literature at Columbia, they teach you how to study literature, and it was eye-opening for me to learn how to read literature. Piatigorsky's storytelling was interesting to me. This was during my third year of college, and he'd launch into a story from left field. You had no idea how is this relevant? But if you watched him circle and fly, all of a sudden, like a hawk, he would finally, 20 minutes later, he would land on his point, his message. And it was beautiful to see, I wished it had been videotaped. Occasionally I would take notes on some of his stories. But I did think during that year of becoming a professional cellist and following my older brother into music professionally. And I was practicing 5 hours a day, 4 or 5 hours a day, and during that year, and taking it really, really seriously. I put my pre-medical studies on hold, and that was as close as I came to really thinking of being a musician.
Yes.
Towards the end of that year, I saw how much fun I was having making music, and I saw that my older brother, who is beginning to concertize around the world as a soloist with different symphonies, I began to see how not only how hard he was working, but how much stress he was under, having to pay attention to the reviews, and the business side of jobs and the politics of being a professional musician, and I realized, I would really have a lot more fun with music if I didn't have to make a living doing it.
Yes, it's true of so many things.
Yeah. So So with Piatigorsky's blessing and my brother's blessing too, because he was such a mentor to me, I went back to Columbia and finished up my pre-med studies, and then came to Cambridge. Came to Boston to come to medical school at Harvard, and but then I continued to feel itchy because I obviously I ended up leaving medicine too, from a clinical point of view. Um, uh, but what I love about how I finally put the pieces together when I started teaching is that I bring music into my classroom. I have 3 evenings, 3 hours each, 3 evenings, starting in week 10 of my 13-week semester, where we do musical exercises.
Oh, fantastic.
Because because it's important in thinking about leadership to help people think about creativity, to help people think about improvisation, the idea that leadership is an improvisational art. You can't just play off a score,
Yes.
because reality is emerging and changing, and people are nonlinear systems. So, you have to maintain an improvisational flexibility, um, and to think about inspiration. How do you move people? How do you even change what people value, or reconnect people with values that will make them suffer losses and make sacrifices? Uh, Music has a language, for thinking about inspiration and creativity and improvisation.
Mhm.
Even listening, how to listen musically and not simply analytically. Because, of course, in leadership, you have to listen carefully to the song beneath the words.
Yes.
What values are at stake? What is it that people are really saying, but they can't say it? And how do I then probe and listen more carefully and tease out, what's really at stake for people, so that you understand, what is it that you need to then connect with and speak to, if you're trying to mobilize them to take on and own a piece of the work that is theirs to do in a collective system.
Yes. I have to say that's a very beautiful analogy. I think using music in that manner to really understand how you work with others and also with yourself, I think is really very beautiful, Ron.
Thank you.
So here at LabXchange, our tagline that we use quite often is learning without limits. And I think you've
Beautiful.
touched on this several times already, that quite often part of sort of activating that sense of adaptive leadership in oneself has to deal with sort of addressing limitations that might be real, they might be imagined, they might be a combination of the two. So I'm curious, in terms of your long and really amazing career, can you share with the audience what would have been a limit or a hurdle that you had to get over to bring you to the Ron Heifetz we have today?
I've learned a lot about leadership in part from my own failures in the practice of leadership within the institution I live. I've devoted 37 years to the Harvard Kennedy School, and I know the institution intimately, and the institution was founded just 13 years, 14 years before I arrived. So it's a young institution, and my own failures of leadership in institution building, as well as my successes. The really important principle in thermodynamics, or in biology, that constraints, are necessary to accomplish work.
Yes. Mhm.
That without constraints, you have entropy, but it's the constraints that generate work out of energy, if I'm understanding that properly in my simple understanding. But certainly biologically, it's the scaffolding and the constraints that enable any biological system to function energetically. So
Yes.
so um, uh, so so um, I bumped up against constraints because I tend to naturally move across boundaries of possibility,
Of course.
as I have in my career. So you bump into constraints, and then you have to figure out how to create within those constraints. And I've had to figure out how to create within the constraints of the Kennedy School, which is a school that is deeply devoted to solving public problems, but from my point of view, overestimates the degree to which that can be done with analytical and authoritative expertise, to the neglect of the degree to which public problems require public engagement, because the publics are part of the problem.
Right.
And there's an inclination to want to fly over, where the experts talk to experts on the West Coast to the East Coast or up and down the East Coast, but nobody lands in Nebraska or Ohio or Minnesota to talk to where people live. It's as if we don't really believe in democracy as a collaborative, co-created problem solving. It's that, put the patient to sleep and let the experts speak truth to power, implement our best know-how, and just trust us, everybody. We're going to solve the problem. But these adaptive challenges are not amenable to that mode of know-how. But yet, that mode of know-how, which is endemic to Harvard and other institutions that are trying to push the frontier of expert knowledge, also tend to have an unrealistic idea of the degree to which relying on expert knowledge is going to solve all the kinds of problems we're facing. So so I've been banging up against that constraint within the Kennedy School, and I think within the university. Mm-hmm. And that's been a challenge to me. And one direction it's taken me is, of course, to develop in-house capacity. Now there are 3 other faculty teaching the courses that I started teaching in 1983. Of course, the course itself has evolved. The basic course, there are now 3 courses. And 500 students a year are taking those courses. But they're not required. They're elective. Mm. Because the emphasis on expert problem solving is still the dominant paradigm, even within my own institution. So I've had to figure out, how to create kind of a greenhouse where at least people can thrive doing this other kind of problem solving. It's essential to public policy, and survive and continue to build out, and of course develop connectivity into our larger expert community, and keep experimenting and developing symbiotic relationships. Mm-hmm. And synergistic relationships out into that expert community, where instead of them feeling discounted or devalued by us, simply realize that we're trying to work the part of the problem that they don't know how to work. Right. You're the cardiac surgeon, that's great. You do the open heart surgery with enormous finesse, but somebody's got to figure out how to get that patient to change the way they're living. Mm. How to give up the food that reminds them of home. Yeah. Yeah. And start eating vegetables. And that's a big ask, So developing that. So those are some of the constraints that have shaped my work, as well as developing capacity around the world for people to teach leadership and develop leadership, develop leadership pipelines for different local environments around the world, because I think we need really high quality leadership, both with authority and without authority, across sectors, and as this current crisis is illustrating.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that I think is a great note for us to end on, this incredibly nuanced view of the fact that leadership is not simply about sort of the individual with sort of authoritative knowledge, but that in some ways it's more of a systems opportunity. It's more of a networked kind of opportunity. And quite frankly, pulling from sort of the principles of biology, resiliency of a species quite often sits in the population, in the network. And so I think that's a very interesting way and a really nuanced way for us to think about leadership. And I suspect, Ron, that this crisis is going to hopefully push a more deeper understanding and hopefully an embracing of that approach, which I know has been so much sort of a part of your life and indeed your mission for all of these decades. So Ron, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us on the Xchange. I hope that we will be able to get together face to face again, sort of before too long. I know that that will pull you from Hawaii, but I do hope it will be worthwhile for you to come back to Cambridge so that we can share coffee and breakfast again as we did in the past so many times. Ron, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I'm not only looking forward to that, but I'm also looking forward to you giving me my next biology lesson so I can continue to refine the metaphor.
No, I think we have a lot to talk about, let me tell you. So yes, I really look forward to that.